The hall was filled with quiet laughter, the kind that floats lightly in the air and disappears just as quickly, leaving no trace behind. It was an informal gathering, a rare moment of calm after years of missions, losses, and victories that never made it into public speeches. The General of the Marine Corps leaned back in his chair, his uniform immaculate, medals reflecting the soft light of the chandeliers. His voice carried authority even when he joked, the weight of decades of command etched into every word. He looked at her with a half-smile, one that suggested amusement rather than interrogation, and casually asked how many targets she had eliminated during her service. The question was meant to lighten the mood, a harmless tease among soldiers who understood the cost of war. Around the table, a few officers chuckled, some raised their eyebrows, others simply waited, sensing that something about this moment was different. She did not smile. She did not shift in her seat. Her posture remained straight, her hands calmly folded, her eyes steady and distant, as if they were focused on something far beyond the walls of the hall. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet it cut through the room like a blade through silk. She said she had never counted them. The laughter faded instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The general tilted his head, surprised, perhaps thinking she was being modest or evasive. But she continued, explaining that numbers were for reports, for people who never stood face to face with consequences. For her, each target had a name, a face, a moment in time that never truly ended. The room grew heavier with every word. She described how the first mission changed her forever, how she had been young, trained to be precise, efficient, and emotionally detached, yet unprepared for the way memory refuses to follow orders. She spoke of nights where sleep was impossible, of faces that returned in dreams not as enemies but as human beings frozen in their final seconds. The general's expression shifted from amusement to something closer to respect, even regret. She explained that asking for a number was like asking how many times a heart had broken, how many breaths had been taken, how many lives had intersected briefly and violently before disappearing. Her answer was not dramatic, not loud, yet it carried a force that pressed against every listener's chest. She said she remembered the ones she couldn't save just as clearly as the ones she was ordered to stop. Some were threats, some were victims of circumstance, all were reminders that war does not end when the mission is complete. The general slowly straightened in his chair, realizing that his joke had opened a door to a truth rarely spoken aloud. She looked directly at him then, not with accusation, but with calm honesty, and said that if he truly wanted an answer, it was this: the number was irrelevant, because every single one had taken something from her that could never be returned. Silence wrapped around the room, thick and heavy, as the officers sat motionless, confronted not with statistics or strategy, but with the human cost hidden behind ranks and commendations. The general nodded slowly, his voice failing him for the first time that evening. In that moment, everyone understood that her response was not just an answer, but a mirror held up to the reality they all shared and rarely acknowledged. The silence that followed her words did not break easily, it lingered, stretching seconds into something almost tangible, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken memories. Someone at the far end of the table cleared his throat, then stopped, realizing there was nothing appropriate to say. The general glanced around, reading the faces of the officers he had commanded for years, men and women hardened by training yet visibly unsettled now. He finally spoke, softer than before, asking her where she had learned to carry such weight with such calm. She did not answer immediately. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the window, where the city lights shimmered against the dark, each one reminding her of places she had once observed through scopes and night vision lenses. She began to tell a story, not of heroism, but of beginnings. She spoke of a small training base far from ceremony and applause, where days started before sunrise and ended long after muscles had given up. She described instructors who taught discipline with iron voices and sharper expectations, who repeated that hesitation was death and emotion was weakness. She admitted that she had believed them at first, had embraced the idea that becoming a weapon meant stripping away parts of herself. The officers listened closely as she explained how efficient that belief felt during training, how clean and simple the world appeared when reduced to objectives and outcomes. But then she described her first deployment, the moment theory collided with reality. She spoke of a village reduced to rubble, of orders delivered through static-filled radios, of moving shadows that might be enemies or might be terrified civilians. Her voice remained steady, but the room sensed the effort it took to keep it that way. She recalled a moment when she hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough to see fear in another person's eyes, long enough to understand that they were as lost as she was. That hesitation, she said, never left her, even though the mission continued and the report later marked everything as successful. The general's hands slowly folded together as he listened, recognizing fragments of his own past in her words. She went on to explain how missions blurred together over time, how locations changed but emotions repeated themselves with relentless precision. She spoke of comrades who laughed loudly to hide their trembling hands, of brief friendships forged under fire and ended by a single mistake or a burst of gunfire. Each loss, she said, added another invisible layer to her, making her stronger in combat and quieter everywhere else. She described returning home between deployments, walking through crowded streets where people complained about trivial problems, unaware of how fragile their ordinary lives truly were. She said that was when counting numbers became impossible, because every face reminded her of someone she had once seen through a crosshair, every laugh echoed with voices that would never be heard again. One officer finally asked how she managed to keep going, how she continued to serve when the cost was so high. She answered that duty was not just about orders, but about responsibility to her team, to the people she protected, and even to the truth of what she had become. She explained that she learned to live with the weight by refusing to pretend it did not exist. Instead of burying memories, she carried them openly within herself, letting them shape her choices and her silence. The general felt a deep, unfamiliar tightness in his chest as she spoke, realizing that leadership often demanded listening more than speaking. She concluded by saying that the joke question had not offended her, but it had reminded her how easily war could be reduced to numbers by those far from its consequences. Her calm response, she said, was not meant to shock, but to remind everyone present that behind every statistic was a story that never truly ended. As she finished, the room remained quiet, not from discomfort now, but from respect. The general slowly nodded, understanding that this gathering had transformed into something far more important than a casual evening. He realized that her answer was still unfolding, not just in words, but in the shared awareness settling over everyone present, an awareness that once gained could never be ignored again. Time seemed to shift after that evening, as if her words had quietly altered the rhythm of everyone who heard them. The gathering eventually dispersed, chairs scraping softly against the floor, officers exchanging brief nods instead of jokes, each carrying away a private reflection they were not ready to share. The general remained seated long after most had left, staring at the empty chair across from him where she had sat. He had commanded divisions, planned operations that altered borders, signed orders that sent thousands into danger, yet he realized that leadership had rarely confronted him with such a direct, human truth. Days later, he requested her presence in his office, not as a superior summoning a subordinate, but as a man seeking understanding. When she entered, the room felt different from the ceremonial halls she was used to. Quiet, lined with old photographs of past commanders whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. The general gestured for her to sit and admitted that her answer had stayed with him, replaying in his thoughts during sleepless nights. He asked her what happened after all those missions, after the uniform came off and the world expected her to return to normal. She took a slow breath, as if opening a door she usually kept locked, and began to describe a life lived between two realities. On one side was discipline, structure, and clarity of purpose, on the other was a civilian world filled with noise, expectations, and misunderstandings. She spoke of returning home to family gatherings where people praised her bravery but quickly changed the subject, uncomfortable with details they did not want to imagine. She described how silence became her refuge, how she learned to listen more than speak because words felt inadequate to bridge the gap between experience and understanding. The general listened without interruption as she explained how memories surfaced unexpectedly in the sound of fireworks, in the sudden backfire of a car, in the way shadows moved at dusk. These moments, she said, were not dramatic enough to be noticed by others, yet powerful enough to steal her breath. She explained that she never saw herself as broken, only changed, reshaped by circumstances that demanded adaptation. What troubled her most was not what she had done, but how easily the world moved on, how quickly sacrifice became a paragraph in a report or a line in a speech. The general leaned forward, asking if she ever regretted choosing this path. She paused, searching for an answer that felt honest rather than comforting. She said regret was too simple a word. There were moments of doubt, moments when she wondered who she might have been had she chosen differently, but there was also a deep sense of purpose that anchored her. She explained that service had given her clarity about life's fragility and value, a perspective that could not be learned in safer ways. She spoke of younger recruits she mentored, teaching them skills while quietly reminding them to hold on to their humanity, to understand that strength did not mean emptiness. The general felt a quiet shame realizing how often the institution focused on efficiency while neglecting the cost carried by individuals. He admitted that he had once believed emotional distance was necessary for command, that acknowledging pain would weaken resolve. Her story challenged that belief, showing him that unacknowledged pain only deepened over time. She told him that the joke question, though small, symbolized a larger problem: the habit of turning complex human experiences into simple metrics. Numbers, she said, created distance, allowing people to discuss outcomes without confronting consequences. She explained that if leaders truly wanted resilience, they needed to create spaces where truth could exist without judgment. The general felt the weight of responsibility settle differently on his shoulders, heavier yet clearer. He realized that honoring service required more than medals and ceremonies, it required listening, adapting, and sometimes admitting past mistakes. As their conversation drew to a close, he thanked her, not formally, but sincerely, for trusting him with her truth. She stood to leave, her posture as composed as ever, but there was a subtle shift in the room, as if something essential had been acknowledged at last. After she left, the general sat alone, looking again at the photographs on the walls, wondering how many untold stories existed behind those stern faces. He understood then that her answer to his question was still echoing outward, challenging assumptions, reshaping leadership, and quietly insisting that behind every command, every mission, and every victory, there were human lives carrying invisible histories. The changes that followed were subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone who was not looking closely. The general began to alter the way meetings were conducted, allowing moments of silence where there once had been only rapid-fire briefings and clipped conclusions. He started asking different questions, not about efficiency alone, but about impact, morale, and the quiet burdens carried by those under his command. Some officers noticed the shift and were uncertain how to respond, others felt an unexpected sense of relief, as if permission had finally been granted to acknowledge thoughts they had long suppressed. Word spread quietly that something had changed at the top, that leadership now listened in a way it hadn't before. She continued her duties as always, precise and disciplined, but she sensed the difference too. Younger soldiers approached her more often, not with bravado or exaggerated confidence, but with honest uncertainty. They asked how to survive not just physically, but mentally, how to return from missions without losing themselves entirely. She never gave speeches or dramatic advice. Instead, she shared fragments of truth, explaining that fear was not failure, that remembering was not weakness, and that carrying the weight together made it lighter than carrying it alone. She spoke of routines that grounded her, of small rituals that reminded her she was still human beyond the uniform. These conversations rarely lasted long, yet they lingered in the minds of those who heard them. Meanwhile, the general found himself revisiting his own past with a clarity he had long avoided. Late at night, alone in his office, he reread old reports and mission summaries, noticing how cleanly suffering had been edited out of the language. Successes were measured, losses quantified, but the emotional cost was nowhere to be found. He wondered how many times he had unknowingly dismissed pain with a joke or a statistic, how many opportunities he had missed to truly support those he led. He began consulting psychologists and veteran advocates, pushing for programs that addressed long-term impact rather than immediate readiness. Resistance came quickly, change always met tradition with friction. Some argued that focusing too much on emotion would weaken resolve, that war required hardness above all else. The general listened, then responded calmly, explaining that unacknowledged damage did not disappear, it only resurfaced later, deeper and more destructive. She watched these developments with quiet observation, never seeking credit, never stepping forward as a symbol. Her intention had never been to inspire reform, she had simply answered a question honestly. Yet she understood that truth, once spoken, had a way of moving through people in unpredictable ways. During one mission briefing, she caught her reflection in a darkened screen and barely recognized the person staring back. There was strength there, yes, but also weariness, patience, and a depth shaped by experiences few would ever fully grasp. She realized that while she could not change her past, she could influence what came next for herself and for others. On a rare day off, she walked through a public park, watching families laugh, children run freely, couples argue over trivial things that somehow mattered deeply to them. She felt both distant and deeply connected, aware that the peace around her was fragile, protected by sacrifices rarely acknowledged. She did not resent that ignorance, instead, she accepted it as part of the reason she had served. The general, too, found moments of unexpected clarity outside his role. He attended a small, private memorial service for fallen soldiers, one without cameras or speeches. Standing among families and comrades, he felt the full weight of individual loss, unfiltered by protocol. He realized then that leadership was not about having all the answers, but about being willing to stand in uncertainty with others. When he spoke afterward, his words were simple and unpolished, yet they carried sincerity that resonated more deeply than any formal address. She stood among the crowd, listening, recognizing a shift in tone that mirrored the conversation they had shared weeks earlier. Their paths crossed briefly afterward, and the general thanked her again, this time with a nod that conveyed mutual respect rather than rank. She returned to her duties with the same quiet resolve she had always carried, but now there was a sense that her burden, while still heavy, was no longer invisible. The joke that had started everything felt distant now, almost insignificant compared to what it had revealed. She understood that questions mattered, but answers mattered more, and sometimes, the most powerful answers were the ones that refused to be reduced to numbers. As the days moved forward, both she and the general carried the same unspoken understanding, that true strength lay not in denying the cost of war, but in facing it honestly, together, and allowing that honesty to shape a more humane path forward. Years later, when the story of that evening surfaced in quiet conversations and half-remembered anecdotes, it was never told as a moment of confrontation or drama, but as a turning point so subtle that many did not recognize it until long after it had passed. The general eventually retired, his final address stripped of grand strategy and triumphant language, focusing instead on responsibility, memory, and the unseen costs carried by those who serve. Some found his words unusual, even uncomfortable, but many more felt seen for the first time. He spoke about leadership as an act of care, about command as a bond of trust rather than distance, and about the danger of reducing human lives to numbers that fit neatly into reports. Those who listened closely sensed that his perspective had been shaped not by policy alone, but by a single honest answer given without intention to impress or provoke. She continued to serve for a time, moving through missions with the same precision and restraint, yet something within her had settled. The truth she had spoken no longer felt like a private burden carried alone, it had been heard, and that mattered more than she had expected. Eventually, she stepped away from active service, not dramatically, not with celebration, but quietly, as she had done most things in her life. Transitioning into civilian life was not easy, but she approached it with the same discipline she had learned years earlier. She found work mentoring veterans, not as a counselor or public figure, but as someone who listened without judgment and spoke only when words were needed. She never shared numbers, never catalogued experiences, never allowed her past to become a spectacle. Instead, she focused on helping others name their own experiences, reminding them that their stories were valid even when they were difficult to articulate. Sometimes, in small group settings, someone would ask her about her service, about what she had done, about how much she had seen. She would answer with the same calm honesty she had shown that night, explaining that what mattered was not how much had been done, but how it had changed those who lived through it. Meanwhile, the institution itself shifted slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. New training programs emphasized psychological resilience alongside physical readiness. Commanders were encouraged to listen as much as they instructed. Conversations once dismissed as weakness began to find space within official structures. It was not a revolution, but an evolution, one shaped by accumulated voices, by courage expressed not in action alone, but in truth. The general watched these changes from a distance, aware that progress was fragile, always at risk of being undone by convenience or habit. Yet he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that something meaningful had begun, sparked by a moment he would never forget. In private, he often reflected on how close he had come to missing it entirely, how easily that evening could have ended in laughter and nothing more. He understood now that leadership was defined not by authority, but by the willingness to be changed by those one leads. As for her, she carried her past with the same steadiness she always had, but without the weight of invisibility. On certain evenings, she would walk through the city at dusk, watching lights come on one by one, feeling both separate from and deeply connected to the world around her. She did not seek peace in forgetting, she found it in acceptance. The memories remained, but they no longer demanded explanation or justification. They were simply part of her, shaping her empathy, her silence, and her strength. Occasionally, she would receive a message from someone she had once served with, thanking her for a conversation that had helped them through a dark moment. She never replied with long messages, only brief acknowledgments, understanding that presence mattered more than words. The story of the General's question and her answer was never officially recorded, never turned into a lesson plan or a case study. Yet it lived on in changed behaviors, in quieter rooms, in questions asked more carefully. It became a reminder that humor, when careless, could reveal truths one was not prepared to face, and that honesty, when offered without anger, could reshape understanding more powerfully than force. In the end, what she answered was not a rejection of the question, but a refusal to let experience be diminished. She had not provided a number, because numbers could be forgotten, compared, or dismissed. Instead, she had offered something far more enduring, a truth that demanded reflection. And for those who heard it, especially the general, it became clear that the most important victories were not those counted after battles, but those achieved quietly, when a person chose to listen, to learn, and to acknowledge the full humanity behind every uniform.